the first thing I'm going to do is give y'all a couple of definitions. The first one is public history. What is public history? I don't think oftentimes any of us do a well enough job of explaining what we do. So think of public history almost like as an umbrella term. And I'm just going to go ahead, y'all can read with me. Public historians serve as advocates for preservation, care, and accessibility of historical records and resources of all kinds, including intangible cultural resources. They call themselves historical consultants, museum professionals, government historians, archivists, oral historians, cultural resource managers, curators, film and media producers, historical interpreters, historical preservationists, policy advisors, local historians, and community activists. Now, today I am going to be talking specifically, for the most part, about being an archivist. But what I'd like to also show you, and I hope it happens throughout today's conversation, is that out of that list, I've done the following in my career. And this is not unusual, by the way. I am an historical consultant. I've been a museum professional. I have not been a government historian. I am an archivist. I'm certified. As Bill mentioned, I went to Loyola for my undergraduate degree in history, got my master's at UNO. I came out at a time, I'm in my 50s, where I was right on the border that if you wanted to go into the archives field, you could take two routes. You could take a history route, just get all your degrees in history, you specialize in something local, or you take the library sciences route. I ended up, and I'm a little bit of a relic, I came right at that border. I'm like, I don't want to go to library school. I like history. And so I ended up taking the history route. So, but I've also have served as, I am an oral historian, and currently that's one of the things I'm practicing a little bit more often than other tasks. I've also been a cultural resource manager, a curator, film and media producer. I've been a media producer, but I've worked on a number of documentaries for American Experience. One on the yellow fever epidemic of 1853, the second one on the history of New Orleans. So I had a hand in it. I was basically an image wrangler. I would try to find things like that Louis Armstrong photo and go, do you want to use this? Because I knew my collection really well. I've also have served as an historical interpreter. Historic preservationist to a certain extent, but it's a little bit different because I dealt with severely damaged materials following Hurricane Katrina and the levee breaches in 2005. Also, I am currently a public policy advisor to Amistad. I am a local historian, and this is where the most important part of all this is being a community activist. And this is where I am going to talk about some things personal. Those of us who enter this field usually are coming out of, for whatever reason, an ethos of service. And sometimes it could be someone who, there's a woman who's a school teacher in Madisonville, and she runs the Madisonville Museum in her spare time. And she's a really great representation of someone who is looking to serve her community, help preserve the history of her community, and it's all volunteer, and now she runs the museum. And if any of y'all are from St. Tammany or do a little jog to Madisonville, it's a cute little museum. It's tiny, it's in their old jail cell. But for many of us, we come out of a place of giving back to our communities. I was born in New Orleans, grew up in Covington, and attended St. Scholastica. And one thing I can say about SSA is that we had to do community service hours in order to graduate. And I think that was the first taste for me of giving back to my community. Once I started attending Loyola, Loyola has a very strong social justice vein running through the university, as well as a spirit of cooperation, a spirit of, again, giving back to communities. And one person I'm going to be speaking about quite a bit today, so I want y'all to remember his face. His name is Michael Mindell Nelson. And Michael, when I was a student at Loyola, I worked at the social justice organization on campus, the Toomey Center for Peace and Justice. And the guy that I worked for, his name's Richard McCarthy, he would say, oh, you need to meet my friend Streetcar Mike. You would love Streetcar Mike. He's getting his PhD at Tulane, and you're a history kid. You should meet this guy. So I met Streetcar Mike. He seemed like a nice guy, He did a documentary on streetcars, and that was about it. So I kind of packed him away in my box of memories in my head and moved on. But Michael started out as a community activist. And eventually goes into history as a profession, becomes an academic historian, but his love was always in the community. And so he becomes instrumental in the development of the Midlo Center for New Orleans Studies, along with Connie Atkinson and today Molly Mitchell. I'll be speaking about them a little bit more as well. And Michael was just incredibly influential, not just to me, but a whole host of students. I would not be where I am today had it not been for Mike. Now, we unfortunately lost Michael about 10 years ago to cancer. And he was probably in his late 40s, early 50s. And he was an historian ahead of his time. And so just kind of remember that sweet little face. Now, out of that umbrella, we're going to talk about the archival field. And I'll also read a couple of statements from the Society of American Archivists. This is the governing body for the field. And these statements also really get to the heart of what archivists do. So again, I'm going to just kind of read for y'all. Archivists select, preserve, and make available primary sources that document the activities of institutions, communities, and individuals. So basically, I have paper. I don't use pen. I have my Lucky pencil with me at all times. So I like paper. And there are many different types of positions in the archives field. I am what is called a processing archivist. I am the one who goes into the dirty boxes, pull things out, put them in some sort of order, give it a sense of organization, and then usually the next step is to make it available to the public. The second statement, I think, is crucial to understanding, because it is following along this idea of community spirit and being an activist of some sort. Since ancient times, the archives have afforded a fundamental power to those who control them. In a democratic society, such power should benefit all members of the community by documenting institutional functions, activities, and decision-making. Archivists provide an important means of ensuring accountability. In a republic, such accountability and transparency constitute an essential hallmark of democracy. Archivists take seriously the ethics of our field. We consider ourselves a line of defense in the protection of democracy. We offer materials to the public so that the government or the owner of a company or whatever can be held accountable, or be praised that they might be doing something right. But we are a line in the defense of democracy. And that is why my favorite person on the planet, Benjamin Franklin, is sitting on this slide. Now, this portrait came from a client of mine. I found myself at one point, I had a book that came out. This guy, a billionaire in Texas, happened to see it on a Wednesday. Thursday morning, I get a phone call from one of his vice presidents, and she says, he saw your book, he loved it, he's working on a book, we want you in Dallas Monday morning. And I'm sitting there going, is this a serial killer? I mean, what am I walking into? So, I do the Googles, and I'm like, okay, he's a billionaire. And so I called my mother, And I said, I think I'm going to Dallas. And next thing I know, I'm sitting in business class, having a glass of champagne. I find myself sitting in a 4-star hotel in the arts section of Dallas. And when I walked into this gentleman's office, this portrait was sitting above the receptionist's desk. Who has stuff like this above your receptionist's desk? He also owned the Gilbert Stuart portraits of George Washington that you find on the $1 bill, and Martha Washington. And he had one, I think it was one of maybe 3 or 4 sets in the country, and he owned that. It was a treasure trove, time after time, day after day. And in my world of the history part, I like having historical boyfriends. They make life a lot easier. I also have historical enemies that I'm not going to talk about because they'll make me mad. And to honor Bill, my tutor boyfriend, Thomas More, good choice, and colonial boyfriend, Ben Franklin. And so it was just such a fantastic opportunity. Even though I'm an archivist and I work with paper and photographs, I get to work now on portraits. And so one thing with the field, you have to be on your toes. You're constantly learning. You're constantly pivoting. Especially when I'm trying to get a client, I can do everything. I try not to say no. And but I got to do some work on Ben, and now I get to have his picture with me all the time. So it's actually kind of awesome. If you have any questions about my other boyfriends, feel free to ask in the Q&A. So because I have them all lined up, mainly New Orleans history and Louisiana. But one other thing that I hope to show you today, as far as pivoting, I'm finding myself at this time working for this gentleman, really delving into colonial history and early American, which I studied under one of the best for that, who is Mark Fernandez at Loyola, as Bill mentioned. But that was hardly my specialty as an historian. As an historian, my specialty is African American education in New Orleans during the long civil rights movement. Hardly Ben Franklin, hardly colonial America. And I did get to be in colonial America. I'm still upset about that too. So. Whoops. Oh, okay, so I'm going to tell you just real quickly about my experiences at Loyola. One thing I realized as a student, that my career started that day. You sometimes think about, I want to do this later on, I want to do this later on. One thing I quickly learned, especially as an undergraduate, and through the support of professors, my career started really when I was 19 years old. And as a student at Loyola, I originally was majoring in communications. I was going to go into broadcast production. And I'm an avid Saints fan. So really, as a child, I wanted to be a sports reporter. That's all I thought about. That's all I talked about. Went to Loyola at the time, one of the best communications departments in the South. And I really thought that was the route I was going to take. But I minored in history. And as my coursework continued, I'm really not liking broadcast production, but I'm really loving my history classes. And so I started sitting there going, I don't know if I want to change my major to history. I mean, that's a little frou-frou. Minor is okay, but major, I don't know. But at the time, my 2 best friends, one was my roommate, another one, she might as well lived with us, even though she was a student here at SLU, were both history majors. One of them had a brother-in-law who was also who taught history here at SLU. And I just remember thinking to myself, well, you know what? If Bill can have this amazing career as an historian, I can do that too. And I found myself, because I've known Bill since I was about 15 years old because of Tasha, that my best friend's brother-in-law all of a sudden became Dr. Robinson, and to be able to talk to Bill at the time, being again, just kind of mentioning things. I'm thinking of switching to history. And also, taking Mark Fernandez's classes were just, he's a brilliant lecturer, so much fun to take his classes, hard as I'll get out. Saying that, however, through Mark, I received an internship my senior year at Historic New Orleans Collection. And this internship was, I guess, about 20 hours a week. I was working in the manuscripts department under Alfred Lemon, and the collection they had me process came from the Wilkinson Stark family papers. And I consider myself very lucky today that I know the minute that I wanted to become an archivist. And it has to do with this letter from 1807 from Horatio Stark to our man here, Comfort Tyler. And basically, this is a very dry description. It's one of the best letters I've ever read. Horatio Stark, whose family has something to do with the settlement of Starkville, Mississippi, wrote Comfort a letter saying, "Dude, I'm so sorry I implicated you in Mr. Burr's little plot." And being a 19-year-old, 20-year-old, sitting there with this piece of paper, holding a piece of American history, that's when I knew that it was just this moment of magic. And that's part of today's description, because there are magical moments all throughout my career. And it's normally things I get to come across. And so from that internship, and this collection in particular, came my honors thesis through Loyola, where I wrote the biography of Mary Farrar Wilkinson, who's one of the people who pops up in this collection. And also through the internship, I ended up writing a second paper on a woman named Peggy, who was enslaved in St. John the Baptist Parish around 1813 or so, and was involved in a legal case. And from these two projects, I ended up being an undergraduate presenter at the Louisiana Historical Association's annual meeting, which is actually taking place next week. And at the time, it was kind of unusual for undergraduates to present papers, but that was a good step for me in advancing to my career. And also, I get my senior thesis, I get a second paper, I do a presentation. Being involved in the organizations, even as a student, is incredibly important. It helps with developing social skills, presentation. These are the times where you screw up and it's really okay. Everyone's here to support students and to see y'all take that next step. And the third important thing that came out of this internship, and this is what I like to tell people all the time, yes, while that internship, I got a grade. Alfred signed off that I got an A, goes into my transcript. But shortly afterwards, Alfred came up to me and he goes, "Look, we have a project that's in essence, too crappy to give to a staff person and too boring to give to an intern. So, we're going to throw you some money. You want to work for us for a little while?" Well, there's my first job in the archives field, still as a student. And it was the most boring project ever. But I made some decent money. And again, it was something that I could put on transcripts and applications for graduate school. So all of this, by the time I graduate from Loyola, I'm on a fairly decent, wow, whoops. And then I take some time off after graduation. I move to Europe for a while, and I get ready to go to graduate school, come back to the States, and got some great offers from wonderful universities. But when Mark and I chatted about it, he says, if you get into Ole Miss, you want to study Southern history. Winthrop Jordan was still teaching at the time. He's like, "We need to send you off to Ole Miss." And so they send me off to Ole Miss. And it's still kind of the same way in Oxford. Unfortunately, while other universities gave me like full rides and teaching opportunities and benefits and money, Oxford came back and said, yeah, you can have in-state tuition. And so I decided to go ahead and do it. But during that time, Oxford's a pretty expensive little town, especially if you're a graduate student. And I found myself working 3 to 4 jobs just to keep the lights on. And I worked at Proud Larry's. I was a hostess, so got to see some great shows. But I also worked at the Jazz and Blues Archive, and then also worked at a museum. So learning some public history, but not necessarily in archives, because archives and museums were sister industries, a lot of overlapping, but we're also very separate. And we have separate ethics to a certain extent, and I'm not getting into any of that today unless you have a question about it. But it was opening me up to seeing other occupations that I could pursue. Saying that, however, my research was in Louisiana. I was really looking at studying African American women and the creation of benevolent societies in New Orleans. And so I was coming home almost every weekend. And I just sat there and I finally was like, stop beating your head against the wall. You made a mistake. You didn't really figure out the financial implications of some of your choices. Thankfully, UNO still offered me a position. And, so I called them and I said, hey, I want to transfer. I want to come home. They said, sure, come on over. We would love to have you. And at UNO, I was really lucky to have, it was a phenomenal faculty. And I would just quickly go through some names because a lot of these folks are no longer with us, but they were some of the top historians in their field. And I cannot not mention folks like Arnie Hirsch, Madeline Powers, Jared Johnson, who taught historiography. It was very tough. Joe Caldwell. And there's really a litany. But also during that time, Stephen Ambrose was still at UNO. He was running the Eisenhower Center, which was the archives that actually predates the formation of the National D-Day Museum, which becomes the World War II Museum. And also Doug Brinkley. Now, both Steve and Doug are, 1940s, obviously World War II. Doug's soft spot was really more 1950s, 1940s, 1950s. I know nothing after 1917. I hate World War II. No offense, y'all, I could care less about World War II. Just don't like it. I stop at 1917, and I stopped there for a reason. Well, guess what? I'm working for a World War II historian. I better start reading some stuff pretty quickly. And also, during this time, as I'm working for Steve and Doug, which was a just phenomenal experience. And real quickly, at one point I'm working for Doug, and everybody's out on the road, and I'm running the center. And at the time, Doug was working with Hunter S. Thompson on Thompson's memoirs. And one day, his assistant called me, and she's like, Melissa, we can't find chapter 13. Go find chapter 13. And I could hear someone in the background. Okay. And so I get off the phone, and I'm tearing up the office. I'm going through Steve's office, which I know it's not in there, but I have to check. I go through Doug's office, the executive, cannot find it. Assistant keeps on calling me. And then I'm starting to hear words that made me blush. And I was hearing, you don't molest anything like. And Hunter Thompson screaming at me. And I'm just sitting there loving it because really, what opportunity do you get to have Hunter S. Thompson, of all people, to scream at you? And just to let y'all know, they actually had the chapter. We didn't. And so I got an apology later that day. But during this time at UNO, one person I'm going to also mention is Connie Atkinson, who just recently retired. Connie comes from a music background. She was one of those hit chicks back in the 70s, running around the streets of the quarter, living down there. She knew everybody. She knew all the photographers, all the artists. It was really still that when the quarter still had locals living in it, and there was still that bohemian vibe. Well, Connie, as a writer, nothing to do with history. She and some friends start up this magazine called Wavelength. And Wavelength ends up becoming the forerunner of Offbeat magazine, which is associated with WWOZ, which actually just ended a 20-year run, I believe in December. They actually just shut down due to the changes in publishing. Now, this magazine, Wavelength, I started reading when I was about 10 years old because I loved music as a kid. And the reason why I'm pulling this out, because there is one of my favorite bands when I was 10 was the Backbeats. And out of the Backbeats came really some of New Orleans' best music and the formation of rock and punk. You have Steve Walters, who was a forerunner, who was with the Normals. You have Paul Sanchez, and Fred LeBlanc, who found Cowboy Mouth. You have Vance DeGeneres. He has a sister, I think, named Ellen. And Vance was in the Cold. And so, but the Backbeats is a real critical part of that whole music history of New Orleans. Oh, wait, so someone who just said she stops at 1917 is now talking about punk. Again, you kind of have to, pivot. And so UNO recently finished up a project of digitizing every copy of Wavelength. And currently, I believe UNO and the State Museum are the only two institutions that have full runs. LSU has a few. And the cover artwork was always fantastic. I really had a good time going through all those. Now, as I'm finishing up grad school, life kind of happens. So I finished up all my coursework, and I called myself ABT. I was all but thesis. And I knew I could not afford, at the time, to stay in school. I had to go, I didn't have any other classes to take. So this battle, I've always had an internal battle of whether I want to work in the nonprofit field, again, the community bit, or do archival work. Well, I immediately jumped into the nonprofit field at the time because I was ABT. So no one's really going to hire me. And it was quick money, so to speak. And so for many years, I don't even think about the world of history. I'm just doing my thing. And then I go eventually meet the man who becomes my husband. I give birth to our first son, which was in April of 2004. And during that time, a position opens at Tulane Special Collections. And I go into my interview 7 months pregnant. And I say to the person who eventually hires me, yeah, I'm ABT. I still have to write my thesis. I was like, well, get your thesis done while you're working for us. I said, okay, great. So I'm making these plans. I'm going back, I think now, because being in the nonprofit world, you work crazy hours, have a baby in tow, have a husband. I just can't be working at, an event at midnight or 2 in the morning. And so what ends up happening is that I'm at Tulane, I'm doing my thing, I'm learning as much as I can. And then something happened in August of 2005. And it affected everybody. I lost 80% of what I owned. And Tulane suffered significant damage. Our basement was completely flooded. And so it gets to the point where I think to myself, okay, I got to finish some things up because we're dealing with a mess in our own personal lives, trying to rebuild. There's a mess at work for those of you who lived here 20 years ago, because we're about to have the 20th anniversary. It was a brave new world. We didn't know what we were dealing with and what we were going to be encountering. And so there comes again another halt to my career. I have to push off my thesis again and kind of deal with things. And UNO was great, super supportive. But, during that time, I've also been out of UNO for 7 years, which means I have to get readmitted into the program so I can finish my thesis. Again, that's not something I really recommend, but again, life gets in the way. And so during this time, I'm back in school, I'm rebuilding my life, and that guy, Michael Mizell Nelson, called me. And he said, hey, look, I've been offered a book deal. I just don't have the time to do it. Do you want it? And I said, and he's like, this could be It's a for hire gig. You don't get royalties, but you get your name on a book. And I said, you know what? I think I'll do it. This sounds great. Well, it eventually becomes Historic Photos of New Orleans. And here was the conundrum. I had 3 weeks to write the book. Book manuscript was due the same week as my thesis. And so I went on a tirade of espresso and cigarettes. I smoke, so no judgment, y'all. But, so I'm smoking. I have my son, 2 years old, going, Mommy, I bought the builder. And I'm just sitting there talking about history. I'm like, yeah, kid, whatever. But this, and I decided at the point, it's like, what else is going to happen? I need to finish this. I need to finish my thesis. Just get it over with. And so the book comes out. One of the images I get to use in the book, and this is actually also one of my favorite images of all time, is a depiction of streetcar segregation in New Orleans. And the look on the gentleman's face in the back is just so resigned that it has resonated with me for all these 20 years that I've worked with this image. During this time, people are trying to figure out how to deal with all this Katrina stuff. And that guy, Michael Meisel, called me again. And he goes, I have a project. He goes, I think we need to do a digital collection of people's stories, pictures. We need to go out in the field and do oral histories. And we can do this thing that's really new. It's not really been done. It's called digitization. And I'm looking at him, and I said, all right, sure. I'll work on whatever. I lost everything I own. I understand the importance of doing some of this collecting. So Michael sends me off to a conference in Chicago. I'm learning about metadata. It makes no sense to me. And I don't really work on the project. I was on the ground floor of it. But this project, and this is what made Michael so special, it was so ahead of its time. I mean, historians kind of laughed at him, academic historians, going, digitization, what the hell? We don't need everything digitized. It was the infancy of this type of work. And again, Michael was probably 10 years ahead of his time because he also because of this project, it gets picked up by George Mason, it gets picked up by another large university, and it becomes a model for what many archives use today in their collecting and digital projects. And I think that's the end of my ode to Michael Meisel Nelson today. But as you can see, we were so lucky to have some great public historians in New Orleans to guide students and to help them with their careers. And one last thing about Katrina. So as I mentioned, Tulane was completely damaged. I ended up being offered the opportunity to be the lead archivist on the reintegration of Tulane's collections. Now, the picture on the right is actually not Jones Hall, which is where Special Collections is located. This is actually a HTML, the main library, but it gives you an idea what we were walking into. And what happened in Jones Hall is that boxes and collections collapsed on top of each other, and they became mixed. These were all political collections, and they were all contemporary of each other. So we really had to figure out, was this Lindy Boggs' letter from the Boggs collection, or was it from the Sciro collection? And since I had been working there for 4 years, by this point, I was one of the few people who could maybe figure this out. So that's the damage you're looking at. This is how we received all the materials. It was 7,000 boxes. So this is also just walking into the off-site storage was just where we kept everything. Think of Indiana Jones, the first movie at the end where they're putting the ark away, and it's just the rows of boxes. So it's these boxes. I think we had 9,000. It was just some crazy number. And so I ended up during this time developing a new skill of project management. I kind of became the go-to person who could handle complex conundrums and give it some sense and figure it out. And these all smelled still from Katrina. The smell will never leave me. It was gross. Now, as a part of some of these projects, you see, I'm jumping around, and I'm not even mentioning everybody I've worked for. I just want to do the shout out to Louisiana State Museum. I was a registrar for them. I was also curator of manuscripts at LSU. But also during this time, going back to the first days at Tulane, I could pick up little side hustle jobs. And because it's usually researchers are like, hey, do you know anyone who could do some research for me? Because I'm in Wisconsin. And I was like, yeah, I could be your person. So I ended up developing a side business that eventually offers me an opportunity to start working for all these carnival organizations in town. What ends up happening with them is I start working for individual members, their companies, their families. I'm doing genealogies. I'm doing digitization projects. I am working on corporate histories. I've also written other books that I'm not allowed to talk about, but it's basically histories of these carnival organizations. So I become this person where I can go in, I can organize all your records, I can conduct oral histories with all your past presidents and captains, and then I can synthesize all that and write you your club history. And so some of these projects that are taking place, one is this image of the French Opera House, which is on the corner of Bourbon and Toulouse. This was considered at the height one of the premier opera houses in the country, if not the world. New Orleans historically has always attracted folks, the musicians and artists and conductors. And so French Opera House burned down in a horrific fire in 1919. And the only thing that you can still see out of it is the original trough for the horses. They were able to leave that in. Now, this other image I love. So all during this time, remember I said that thing about journalism and sports? Well, blogs are developing during this time. And there's this woman, her name's Shanika Dabney, and she's a huge Saints fan. And so she decides to start up a blog for women who are football fans. All the writers are women, working at ESPN, NFL Network. A lot of them were producers and also women of color. And we all had our teams that we wrote about. So Shanique and I both covered the Saints. She was Nola Chick. I was the mother hen, because we all had chick names. And after the Saints won the Super Bowl, there was an event to celebrate the new season. And it's called NFL Play 60, where they go to the reigning Super Bowl champs city, and they have this huge event. I got to take that picture of Michelle Obama. That is actually my photograph, where I'm standing that close to her, Roger Goodell, and Eddie George. And again, it becomes this moment of magic because everybody talks about her biceps. And I have a picture of her throwing a football. This image will eventually go to this next institution, the Amistad Research Center, which is where I currently work. I consider them a client, but I work there 40 hours a week. And the beauty of Amistad is that it mixes my two loves, more so than any institution I've ever worked for. Because we are the country's oldest independent archives dedicated to Black history and the Civil Rights Movement. You have to believe in community service and giving back. That's a part of our mission. Not all libraries have that kind of mission. We do. And so I've been able, at this point in my career, to mix my two loves in a way I never thought imaginable. Community service, trying to help the next generation of children, and also delving into essentially the history of underrepresented groups, which is always something that interested me. And so my last two images today, this first one is a picture of John Lewis Sr., who is head of the Prince Hall Masons. This is the Black Masons for Louisiana. He is standing next to John Wesley Dobbs, who is head of the Masons in Georgia. And they are giving future Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall checks for $10,000 to fund Brown versus Board of Education. And this is a picture of them handing this check. This is probably one of my favorite items from Amistad, because it shows Louisiana's participation in the Civil Rights Movement, and we do not get any credit the way Georgia does, and don't talk to me about the Atlanta Falcons or Georgia. It becomes a hot mess.